Hello everyone, welcome to From Nowhere to Nothing, Ontological Oxymorons. I'm your host, Joel Bouchard, a doctoral student in psychology, and with me today is Mr. Norman Gayford, a professor of English and philosophy. If there's a topic you'd like us to cover on the show, feel free to email us at fromnowheretonothingpodcast@gmail.com or contact us on our Facebook page. A couple of days from now, Norman and I will be in the path of totality for a total solar eclipse, an event which hasn't happened here in almost 100 years, and which won't happen again for another 120. But before we bask in the awe of the moon's shadow falling over our patch of Earth, we want to talk about that defining feature of the eclipse. Whether figurative or literal, the occlusion of light has followed us everywhere we've gone throughout history, which is how it has earned its namesake, shadow. So we talked about it at the tail end of last week's podcast, and just sort of mentioned it in passing. And then you said, well, why don't we do shadow next week? And I said, okay. And then as we were sort of prepping for the show, I was looking at it and I was like, man, there's so many things here. But I think there's a lot of listeners that might go, well, how do you talk about shadows philosophically, right? So it seems as if shadows are a topic for a science podcast rather than a philosophy podcast. So how can we talk about shadows philosophically?
There are a number of ways. The first one that comes to mind is the idea of perception. And before I go any further, this topic, we're entering topics now, we have been relatively recently, that allow us to sew together and revisit concepts that we laid out earlier. And so to talk about shadows philosophically, one way is to approach with perception, which we've talked about. And subcategorize that perceptions of what? Well, how we see people, how we choose to see people, how we choose to see their behaviors. There's the psychology. How the perception of time is influenced by shadows. So now we're into the object of time, and we've talked much about that, and we'll continue to. And even ethics and linguistics, language pulled together, because how you cast other people by using the word the dark or shadow, or they're grim people. They have a shadow. They cast a shadow over all the good stuff we do. That's ethics. And why do we, and then we're back to perception. Why do we insist on doing that? How come that word in language is so ubiquitous? So we've got language, morality, psychology, and of course, physics.
Yeah, so it's interesting, right? Because it touches on every part of the human experience. And I think that when you look across them all and you say, what does it have in common across all of these different areas? I think what it is it's giving it depth, right?
It is.
It's really giving the human experience three-dimensionality. Whether you're talking about, a shadow that we see on the ground that's cast from the sun, or whether we're talking about the shadow in psychology, or the shadow, anytime we're talking about a shadow, we're talking about giving something depth, making it real,
and power.
Yeah.
And determining the power that it might have.
Yeah. So what is a shadow?
Something that is non-existent, in the sense that it doesn't have any of the quantitative properties that measuring anything else might have. So it's not an anomaly, but it is a mystery. So the shadow is that shape, ever-changing shape, cast by an object. But the object isn't really casting it. The light on the object is causing the shadow. Right?
Yeah. Yeah. And it's really interesting. Lots of times people don't think about the physics of it much, but it's very complicated, right? So you have the umbra, which is what people think of as being the shadow, right? Okay. I'm standing here, light hits me, And anywhere that the light can't hit because it's hitting me causes this shadow. But if you have light coming from a source that's not just a point, from a bigger light source, well, then you're going to have a penumbra, which is sort of a fuzzy outline to the shadow, right? It's not distinct. This is part of the reason that if you look at shadows in astronauts in space, right? You see somebody on a spacewalk and their shadows cast against the space station. It's very sharp, very crisp, very detailed because there's no atmosphere to scatter the light particles. So the shadow's very crisp. So that penumbra is sort of the fuzzy edge to the shadows that's caused by light scattering or a light source that is coming from a couple locations. And then you have the anteumbra, which is if the light is big enough that it can light from one edge of the source can meet light from the other edge of the source around the object's shadow, right? So you're casting the shadow on the ground, but eventually the light meets itself. This is all hard stuff that's sort of hard to explain over audio, but if you look up the terms on the internet,
they're wonderful words,
and
they make you think about it. And they just considering the definitions, we're all out of our depth when we consider physics definitions, except physicists. And even physicists will sometimes say that they're confused by their own notions. All right, so it's fine. But yes, the pen, anti, and all these prefixes to try to essentially talk about something that doesn't have substance.
Yeah.
Insubstantial.
Right. And so you'll be able to see this with the eclipse. The penumbra happens when the moon is partially in front of the sun.
Yep.
And so the cool part is for a total solar eclipse, like what we're going to see is the whole sun will be blocked out. But in an annular eclipse, it's where the moon is slightly closer to the Earth than it is, so that a ring of sunlight goes around the moon. Then you'd have an anteumbra because the light is going all the way around.
All the way around.
So these are all technical details. This is not what's going to be the sort of the bulk of our conversation, but
it's setting the groundwork.
And it's also, there are interesting aspects of it, right? One of them is that shadows move at the speed of light, right? So and astronomers look at this, you can see something pass in front of a light source. If it's 100 light years away, well, guess what? You're still going to see the light from that star for 100 years before the shadow falls onto your telescope, right? So, which makes sense when you think about it, right? It's just something that's blocking the light. So the second that the light source gets cut off, that photon still has to travel at the cosmic speed limit up to your eye. The one that I thought was kind of interesting was that on Earth, when we see something in shadow, let's say I'm standing in the shade, right? If I am in a shadow, my visage appears bluer.
Yeah.
Because now that the color of the sunlight has been taken out of the equation, but the Rayleigh scattering from the atmosphere has not. So the same thing that makes the sky blue when we look at it causes me to look a little bit bluer to the human eye when there's no sunlight falling on it.
And this is connected to an old photographic method called the cyanotype, which essentially light is captured through a use of cyanide or cyanide-like material and other chemicals. Yeah, blue is a really important color with all of this. And if you look at the etymology of the word shadow, a dark image cast by someone or something when interposed between an object and a source. Also to shade. It's related to the word meadow, which is interesting.
Did you look up the etymology? Because I didn't, but now I'm curious.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll get us there. In early mid 13th century, a darkened area. A little bit before that, anything unreal, which is and meant that. that which follows or attends a person, a prefiguration, foreshadowing, there's the literature, imitation copy, that's the 1690s. Faintest trace from the 1580s, a spy who follows, 1859, first time it was used in that way. Uninvited guest.
Huh.
And then it started to get used politically, somebody who shouldn't be there. Grendel is the shadow goer and Beowulf. And so it's to protect with covering wings. So it has negative connotations, a positive connotation, but I'm getting down to, because I was just taking profuse. I got lost in this. It was to obscure the shade, but shade is to shadow as mead is to meadow, and a meadow is a place that is considered a place of protection, a somewhat shaded region, and partially darkened, and so on and so on. So it's not a one-to-one correspondence, but it's indicative of a kind of situational context.
Yeah, and that'll be an interesting discussion we'll have in a little bit here, is this sort of the difference between shadow and shade. Because it is an interesting one to think of, just off the top of your head, when it comes to positive versus negative connotations, because it seems like there's some of each for both, and we might be able to enlighten why that is in a few minutes. But before we get there, I think that there's one other introductory question, right, which is the best known use of shadow in philosophy is Plato, right? And
so
the cave.
Yep.
And so we can go over that if you want to hit it briefly. But has there been anybody else who has talked about shadow in philosophy?
Plentiful. There have been lots, but I think that it's important to dwell just for a moment on the cave, because we've talked about this a number of times. But I've realized, thinking about all of this, that we didn't go. I don't recall that we've gone into the one more detail of that cave, the allegory of the cave, or the paradigm of the cave. So you have people in chains sitting looking at a cave wall. Behind them, there is a wall and a ramp or a walking space, and there are puppeteers who are using puppets, casting shadows on the wall, and for the people who are chained looking at the wall, that's their sense of reality. But it's that puppet detail that I think offers some fresh thought that we can get to.
Yeah.
Where do we start? Eratosthenes, who was one of your folks. He's a polymath from way back in the day. With it, essentially, became master of the Alexandrian library, who gave a lot of thought to the idea of how shadows work. William James, Kant. I mean, that all the way up through there, people have talked about it. And as we go along with our conversation, we can sort of insert that in. But it all pretty much is based on Plato and the cave, and the mathematics, which Aristotle was looking at and others were looking at, of actually measuring. I mean, Eratosthenes is the one who measured the circumference of the Earth by 2 columns, essentially, and he never pretty much left his home base. And he came within 2% of the accuracy that we know now. 2%.
Yeah.
Way back then, by using shadows.
Yeah. Yeah. And so it is really interesting, especially, think about Plato's cave, right? Because I think there's a shallow interpretation that is normally attributed to the story, but there is a deeper aspect to it, right? I think that okay, so we can look at it and say, okay, people see the shadows on the cave wall, and that's what's real to them. But really, it's just this flat two-dimensional reality that it's representative, but it doesn't have the depth of really what's going on, and they can't see it. And so that's sort of what people take away from it. When we start thinking about shadows, there's a lot of things that get added in here, right? Because it's a misconception to think of shadows as being two-dimensional things. Shadows are three-dimensional, right? And so, as a matter of fact,
I technically misspoke when I said you couldn't measure them.
Yeah.
But
so
yeah, they are.
But the three-dimensional properties are very interesting, right? So if we think about sort of that example I used before, if there's a planet that moves in front of a star 100 light years away, so the shadow is the three-dimensional space 100 light years big between that planet and us, and then how it leaves that light source, which is not going to be just a linear shadow that's the size of that planet. It's going to spread out based upon how far the light source is from the planet. And so the volume of a shadow can be pretty significant, right? And there are ways of seeing 3D shadows. If you have enough fog, enough water vapor, the shadows can actually take on depth, right? And this is alarming to some people. I know that there's specific places where you can see it. I think one is in the mountains in California or something. People report seeing these giant shadowy figures in the mountains because of the way that
precisely show.
Yeah, because of the way that the shadows are in the mist, it gives it dimension, and so this dimension that's given to it makes it real to us perceptually. Whereas a shadow, we get used to shadows being these two-dimensional things that follow us around. It doesn't get into our minds as much. But if you give them dimension, now it can trick us. It can become an illusion that starts making us see things that are there.
Raymond Tallis does a lot of articles for philosophy now and has written his own books, but he often has gone to talk about shadows, and he mentions that very thing. He said what they do, these non-existent objects. Well, we can talk about whether they exist or not. We perceive them. Right? They become these lurking figures. He didn't specifically in the reading I did go to that example, but we can easily jump to it. So we can scare ourselves silly. We tell marvelously scary stories with shadows.
Yeah, so when we think about Plato's cave and shadows, and sort of that initial story that everybody takes from it, and shadows as being this two-dimensional thing that isn't real, just a representation of what's out there. There's obviously some truth to that, but there's also this sort of deeper meaning behind what the shadow actually is, right?
Yeah.
This relegation of the shadow to just this sort of two-dimensional representation. No, it's its own thing. It has this invisible mass, this invisible depth that we can't see under all circumstances that is sort of already there.
We try to contain it.
Mm-hmm.
And that word contain, I think, is important because that's what Jung was talking about. And I know we'll get there. But if we try to make it not just able to be understood, but safe. We try to reduce its capacity to make us go to places we don't necessarily want to go. I think this is why it's such a potent philosophical concept. Just like puppets. Because I've had the extreme good fortune of being invited into the edges of puppet culture, because of my second born adult child's work with puppetry, all of the people that I have met and become associated with doing puppets. Puppets are remarkably powerful.
Yeah.
In all kinds of cultural ways. And so the fact that puppets are casting the shadows that people are seeing adds another layer.
Yeah. Yeah, because puppets are almost synonymous with shadows in a theatric kind of way, right? We're using them as sort of representations of ourselves.
Yes, and at the same time, the puppeteer is supposed to be unseen or in the background. Puppeteers often wear full black because the puppeteer is the shadow of the puppet.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And I think that you can extrapolate that out even further, right? We've talked in the past about the holographic universe, right? And how, okay, so to us, if we're thinking of shadows as being two-dimensional things, but our viscera as being the three-dimensional thing that's real. And then we look at the physics and we say, well, actually all of information can be represented by a two-dimensional space. And we talked about how, well, if the universe was inside of a black hole and you were to see it from the outside, it would sort of be a projection of a mirror, of a universe from the outside.
From the outside.
And give this holographic principle. You go, well, perhaps all of this is the shadow, and there's actually something even more real beyond our universe.
Precisely.
So yes, it's almost like these layers of an onion, right? Like you keep going out and out. But yeah, the puppet one is interesting because it's almost a role reversal, right? The human becomes the shadow, and the puppet, which is a representation of humanity in a simplified form,
becomes the character. Becomes the being in the story.
So, how has shadow been depicted in folklore and mythology?
Oh my! Some names that we can mention, you can toss them out. I'll toss them out. But they are memorable enough. Erebus in Greek mythology, the shadow, capital S, in psychology, which becomes pop culturally used. The shadow over Innsmouth, one of Howard Philip Lovecraft's most famous stories, and the shadow out of time. It's, the indigenous, the countless indigenous cultures on the planet have various names for. I won't try to pronounce them all, but shadow beings who are important to balance and to the working of a particular society, all scattered across time and scattered across the planet. And so it's not unlike the psychological aspect. The shadow is often represented in folk tales as the being, the trickster, the being that's trying to lead you to do the wrong thing, or that's the things, the darker part of yourself, or the darker part of someone else is coming after you.
Why do you think that is? Do you think that's directly related to just the darkness of the shadow perceptually, or do you think there's something deeper than that?
I think there's something deeper than that, but I think that's part of it to me, because, man, when I first read about the shadow this is a strange path. In high school, we went to the Toronto Science Center. And I came from a rural spot. It might even be considered almost suburban now because of its proximity to Rochester and Buffalo, but at the time it felt rural. And we went to the Science Center, and this was in 1975, and there was this spot where you could freeze your shadow. It would capture your shadow. You move away, you could see your shadow standing there. I'm glad thank you for indulging me on this, because this is the path for me. All right. So there was being fascinated with the science of how they did that, which seemed not like science. It seemed like magic.
Yeah.
There was, within that same relative time period, my encounter with the shadows, which were the remains of people from the atomic blast. Which unfortunately also was replicated to some extent here and there in 9/11. That humans could be, and I don't want to say the word reduced because that doesn't seem right, essentialized as organic shadows. And then there was the encounter with Jung in college and reading about the shadow. And of course, filtered in there, even in my youth, was this character called the Shadow from Pulp magazines.
That was the detective, right?
That was the detective, right?
I remember being a kid, and some old lady that my mom helped take care of gave her a whole cassette tape collection of the Shadow. So we drive around in the car listening to Shadow cassette tapes from whatever time frame that was. I'm probably the only person my age who's ever even heard of it.
Although there was a movie in the 90s.
Oh, was there? Oh, okay.
That tried to do the Shadow. But anyway, so this is a really sporadic, odd way that path that I was following, encountering this, plus reading Lovecraft, plus reading Lord of the Rings. The Balrog is the creature of shadow and flame that scares the greatest wizard. If it's going to scare a greatest wizard, it ought to scare the rest of us. And then demons were sometimes mentioned in terms of shades and shadows. The shades in Odysseus, and the Iliad and the Odyssey, where that's how the dead are referred to as shades.
Yeah.
So for me, all of that, as reading, getting ready for shadows and philosophy, but all of that was welling back up in my head.
Yeah, I love that, because that fits right into the discussion of folklore and mythology with shadows, because it's kind of like a personal folklore, right? That's your history of shadow. And it's interesting to think about where our conceptions, historical people's conceptions of shadow came from, right? Because when I think about it, right, what we were talking about leading up through that was, is there something more to shadows being associated with negative activity, whether it's deep, dark things or trickstery things, other than just the dark nature of a shadow?
Well, I
think that there is, because I know I've had it happen to myself, right? Where out of the corner of my eye, I'll see my shadow on a wall and I'll be scared, right? I'll jump thinking that it's something else. If you go back farther, right, before electric lights, if you only had a campfire or something and your shadow was playing across the trees, right? You can imagine how much more scared you'd be. It's one thing to have a jump start in modern society. It's another thing to have a jump start in the middle of the woods when there are creatures out there that want to eat you. There are, enemy tribes possibly that want to ambush you, right? And to see the shadow, you go, oh, okay, hey, that thing's playing a trick on me, right? Or that's an evil thing that wants to get me. I think that it's a deep inherent part of it. Another one, the Egyptians, right? The Egyptians had shut, right? Was their
I think that's how you say it.
Yeah. And again, this gets into what now we're calling back to what I was mentioning earlier, the difference between a shadow and a shade in language, right? And I think that this is a very difficult thing to sort of parse apart, because I think, at least for me, right, if I reflect on it, anecdotally, I look at it and I go, okay, well, shadow seems more nefarious, darker, whereas shade, like when you're giving us the definitions, shade seems protective, right? Okay, I'm being protected from the sun. But then shade also seems to be more associated with ghosts, right? Of being representative of the spirit essence of an individual, right? I don't think shadow is used that same way as often.
No, shadow. Well, you shut in the Egyptian system was concerning because it seemed to indicate that there's something of us in that thing that's in front of us, and how can we be that? And then I think that's construed with in other cultures with the idea that the shadow is a conduit to another world. And then there's the whole, then we, I know it's going sideways, but it's really related. Then we attribute, again, in literature and in folklore, strange things to it. So if the shadow is part of us, contains something of us, but is separate to some extent. What's more frightening? Not to have a shadow at all, because then you're a vampire.
Hmm.
Or and what's so? Why is this so upsetting to Peter Pan? He's got to have his shadow back. He's crying because he doesn't have his shadow, and Wendy sews his shadow back on, and then he's all filled with glee. Now I know that's just a story. I hate that phrase, right? but that's telling us something. We want our shadows because we aren't complete without them. Because if we don't cast a shadow, we might not be real.
Yeah, and this comes back to what I was saying at the beginning of the episode, right? When we think about how shadow is used, whether it's across language or stories or all of its different aspects, it's always giving depth and reality to things.
Yeah.
So in that regard, you can understand why Peter Pan would be specifically threatened by a lack of shadow, right? If it were to happen to you or I, we might think, okay, well, what's the big deal? Especially if we lived between the tropics of Cancer and Capricorn and it was noon, where you actually cast no shadow other than directly under yourself. But for Peter Pan, right,
Yeah.
he's sort of inherently a fantastical being. So without the reality of the shadow, what is there to ground him as a phenomenological entity, right?
Right.
I think that it's quite threatening.
It's phenomenological as ontological. Our being itself is caught up with expecting this thing that we know is scientific and physically explainable.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you brought up the shadows of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, right? Because I remember the same thing. Looking through my grandmother's encyclopedias, and seeing the shadows on the steps and things, and reading about it, and just being, a horrified state of awe, right? It's this idea that, okay, these things went off, and here is the last visage of the person. Everything else is gone, but here is the shadow.
So it's the opposite of the Peter Pan thing. And I'm not making light of Hiroshima. I think this is
Right.
deeply important. The shadow lost the person.
Mm-hmm.
And it should frighten us, and it should awe us in the dark, in the gloomiest sublime sense, that we could have rendered people into shadows. So yeah, it carries a lot of weight, even though shadows don't.
Yeah, and to have the record of it there, it's sort of similar to that feeling you get when you see things from Pompeii, right? Things that are something that is so perfectly preserved from instant disaster,
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, that one's specific because the shadow is still there. It's very, very interesting. So yeah, so shadow and shade, right? This idea. I don't know if it's what is your sort of feeling on that between shadow being the dark side and shade being a lighter side, or does this change across culture, or does this change across context, or is there a lot of overlap?
I think there's a lot of overlap. I mean, yes, the first time I encountered the word shade that I recall was reading mid-teens, reading Iliad, Odyssey, and so on, reading Greek mythology, shade. So for a while, shade was, that's Greek myth. But no, because there are people, spiritual, various religions refer to the shade. And I think it does cross over because it's not all uniformly grim or threatening. The Buddha says, we are shaped by our thoughts. We become what we think. When the mind is pure, joy follows like a shadow that never leaves. If your mind's pure, your shadow's pure. If your mind's pure, your shadow's playful.
And we see that with the shadow, right? Because there are some ways when it's conceptualized as an evil thing, and sometimes when it's conceptualized as a playful thing, or even as a good thing, right? You see a dog following around its owner, you go, oh, it's just a shadow, right?
Yes.
That's a positive thing.
Yeah.
Or job shadowing, right?
Job shadowing.
Yeah.
Most of us have had some kind of that. I think, at least in this culture, have had that kind of experience. We have all kinds of names for it. Labor that's unpaid, guild training, whatever you want to call it. It's learning by watching and asking and listening.
And it's an interesting thing, right? Because it's reserved for the early parts of learning. Because if you think about that, what does a shadow imply? A shadow can't do anything that the object that's casting it isn't doing, right? And so that's the way that we often learn early on is by closely observing and closely replicating what a model is doing for us in order to accrue some knowledge and in order to develop the sort of instincts and muscle memory in order to perform a function. But at some point that shadow separates from the real thing, right? You can't just repeat what somebody's doing forever and expect that that's going to turn out to be a good thing.
Yeah, well put. There's some point the shadow goes away.
Yeah.
It becomes its own. Pinocchio becomes a human being. I don't know that. But then we have Nietzsche. Nietzsche's most alarming to people. God is dead. God remains dead, and we have killed him. People don't ever often go past that line. The fourth line is, yet his shadow still looms. So that's an interchangeability of shade and shadow to me.
Yeah, and I think that gets into ethics, right? What we're talking about there is ethics and morality, which again is something that is giving depth to the human experience, right? And I think I've been reading Steven Pinker's book Enlightenment Now, and he has a section that's sort of devoted to this, talking about how this fear that atheism or lack of religiosity will cause societal collapse because there will be no need to follow moral or ethical guidelines or codes. And he actually uses that exact quote from Nietzsche when talking about it. But yeah, it's this idea that that all of a sudden we're going to lack we'll become this two-dimensional thing. There's nothing beyond this physical world. But I think that is the important part of Nietzsche's quote, right? The shadow remains. Even if you remove God from the equation, you become an atheist, right? The shadow remains. I think that is the humanistic enlightenment part of people's innate drive towards a intuitive sense of morality, right? The golden rule, the silver rule, the platinum rule, right?
All metallic, all imperialistic notions
right.
of metals that have become made important for economic, and then we turn them into a metaphor.
Yeah.
Still doing it. Platinum credit cards.
Yeah. But yeah, I think that's sort of an interesting relationship. The shadow of God is being humanistic ethics or morality.
Yeah. So it's not people who want to relegate Nietzsche, just terrible. No, there's much more to it than that. Then we back to literature. We have Nathaniel Hawthorne. I was going all over the place with this. I've been having a lovely week. Time flies over us, but leaves its shadow behind. Well, we always hear time flies, or time flies when you're having fun, or whatever it is. Time flies over us, but leaves its shadow behind. Okay, does that mean the shadow of everything that the time is, it remains, or did the shadow disconnect? We've talked about time so much, but there's another view into the idea of time as a shadow. God is gone, the shadow remains. Time flies past us, there's still a shadow. Is that shadow the impression of our lives? The Pompeian momentary impression of a lifetime? It's fascinating.
Yeah, I think it's something different, right? Because time, if time is leaving that shadow as it flies, it's a living thing. It's in motion, right? And what we know about the shadow is if it's in motion, anything that's in motion is going to cause the shadow to constantly be changing shape, right? It's morphing. And I think that's much more analogous to our experience of time and our memories, right? We like to think that we have this concretized memory of how our lives have unfolded, but in reality, as time continues to move, And as the shadow that it casts continues to get bigger, the shadow's also morphing, and our recollection of how things have unfolded continues to morph. And it all unfolds in a way that is always different.
Which is a wonderful segue into Abraham Lincoln. Character is like a tree, and reputation a shadow. The shadow is what we think of it. The tree is the real thing. Now, what you just said, that this is one iteration of that.
Yeah. Yeah. And when you think about that physically, right, what's going to change the shadow of the tree? It's going to be the time of day, right?
As time flies.
Yeah. And
as
so
the
if you,
sun moves.
Yeah. And you think about a shadow of a tree throughout the day. In the morning, it's going to be longer, bigger. And then at noon, it's going to be smallest. And then at the end, it's going to be longer, bigger. You think about our reputations throughout our lives, I think it probably would be something similar, right? When we're all babies or children, people think of us as I think that you're lended these aspirational, sort of idealistic characteristics because there's the potential in a child to become anything, right? And we always want to think that that thing is going to be good, something much beyond what we are. But then in midlife, right, as you're going through just the slog of all of the things that you deal with and your responsibilities, even though you might be at the height of your growth as a tree, right, the shadow you cast is very small, right? Everywhere you go, you have people that you are coming into conflict with, and there's people that you're helping, but some of that just gets lost as being part of the daily interaction and exchange of social things. But then you come to the end of your life, right? And I'm seeing this with a particular guy that died in our community this weekend, and you see that shadow lengthens again, right? You look back in retrospect and you go, well, look at all the things that were accomplished and all the help that was done and all of the And so, yeah, the metaphor is really very interesting, right? From Lincoln.
I hope I didn't lead us too astray on that, but I just thought,
I really like that. So, are shadows limited to light occlusion? I think we've already demonstrated a couple examples where that's not true, but there's a few more, I think.
Well, it physically, even that, I've been reading this, I'm thinking, because I've been indulging this week.
I've got a couple.
In a book by Roy Sorensen.
Okay.
And the whole thing it's called Seeing Dark Things, The Philosophy of Shadows.
Huh.
He wrote it in 2009. And I stumbled on it about on Sunday. So I ordered the book. I downloaded it because the library didn't have it. And it was an indulgence because it's academic, it's mathematic, but it's deeply philosophical, but it's totally accessible. And he talks about a variety of things. I haven't finished the book yet, to full disclosure, but he talks about a variety of things where you can look at a shadow and it's not necessarily cast in the ways we expect. So go ahead with you.
Yeah, so the couple that I came across, one was a rain shadow, right? Which is more of like a rain shade, right? If you think about it, right? So depending on the direction of the wind and what is in the way when the rain falls, there's this section of ground that will be dry, and it will represent a shadow of what is there. I think we've seen this happen if you're walking on a day when it just starts to rain. Particularly happen if it just starts to rain, but it's raining pretty heavy. And you're walking and the wind is blowing. You can sort of see on a concrete sidewalk or on a paved way the outline of a tree or the outline of a building where that's covering it from the rain. You go, oh, okay, yeah, it's a rain shadow, and it's almost the opposite of shadow, right? Because usually that place that's dry is much a lighter color than the place that's wet. The other one, which we're experiencing in this very room, right, is an acoustic shadow. And so I have a little baffle built around my microphone that prevents your voice from entering my microphone and vice versa. And so there's a little bit that's reaching that. And every week as I'm doing the mixing, I find it and I try to take it out so that we have some separation. But the fact is, and you and I have seen this in a very noticeable way since I've redone the acoustic insulation in the room. There's much less of my voice reaching you from where I am than there used to be,
Yes.
right? Because sound waves are similar to light waves, right? And so if you occlude them with something, then there's a sound shadow. And so now the hope in a recording environment like this is that I can cast as strong a shadow as possible on you so that you cannot perceive the acoustics that are coming from my mouth. Right? So
what do you make of this? This has been a profoundly interesting week to me in the quietest ways. Locally, there's a place that everyone goes called the Charcoal Corral. Yeah, right. And it's everything you might imagine: pizza and food and gaming and miniature golf and drive-ins. But I was there with my granddaughter. We were leaving the arcade. It was raining outside, and she looked down into the tar covered. Well, tar. I don't know what it's not concrete, macadam. It's not macadam on the parking lot, and the rain is sweeping over. The wind is moving. So there's oscillations going on, and she stopped and looked down, and she said, "Grandpa, there we are." Well, our reflections were in almost underneath us, seemingly, but so were the shadows of the reflections. So I'm putting this out there as a puzzle, but the water was moving and the wind was pushing the water, and she said, we're vibrating. This makes me think of we are a picture of a soundtrack. And I liked that. I'm still not quite sure. It held weight with me. I wrote it down in my journal and said, well, okay, this is one of those interesting things. But the very fact of seeing oneself, and I knew we were talking about shadows this week, so I've been looking for and seeing very faint shadows because the sun wasn't out. So is the shadow of a reflection a shadow?
Yeah. What is a reflection? A reflection seems to almost be the opposite of a shadow, right? Because whereas I see you and I'm using light from somewhere else to perceive something that's out there, right? A shadow is an occlusion of the light. So it's an absence of the light being able to reach. Whereas a reflection is the light bouncing off and then coming back and projecting that same image. So both a reflection and a shadow render an image of the thing that is being either occluded or reflected. And so in some ways, they're sort of a mirror of each other in a strange way. So yeah, what is a shadow and a reflection? It gets a little crazy. So did you come across shadow memory when you were doing any research? I'm wondering if you saw that concept.
I did not see that concept.
So shadow memory, what I thought was interesting about this one, and this is technology, this is computing, right?
Okay.
It's the ability of certain programs to store information on computer memory that is inaccessible to the computer itself. And so that in that way, the program is able to determine many different things, whether there's errors or what's going on with it, without it being stored on the hard drive, which to me was sort of when we were talking about computers and consciousness.
I was just about to. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm right there with you.
Yeah. It seemed, and of course I don't understand the nitty gritty details of it, but yeah, shadow memory. If you look that up, it's an interesting concept. This idea that we can store information about a program in the computer's memory as opposed to its hard drive, and then use it as a diagnostic in order to determine if there's been an error in the way that the program is operating, right?
Okay, so yes, consciousness constantly fascinates us. In your studies of neurology, have you encountered the equivalent, or are we talking consciousness being that in the brain? Is there a place that we seem to store things?
That was the interesting part to me, right? Was when we looked at our video episode that we did a few weeks ago.
Mhm.
The first guy that we looked at was talking about how there's no hard drive to the brain, right? So we don't know where our memories are stored. So how does consciousness work? Where is it located in the brain? And we don't have that answer yet. But this idea of shadow memory seems like,
unless it's the universe itself, and this is where I think Rory Sorensen would be talking, and a couple of other people in philosophy now that I was reading that suggest that the near death experience, which we've talked about, and that article I sent you this morning, but and you had already seen it, how the brain perhaps keeps trying to start itself like a car that's not starting, and we're turning the key over, but others are suggesting that the energy past the brain, this osmotic whatever it could be, I'm getting mystical and spiritual, but but maybe it's physics. Maybe the energy is, the storage is out in the universe, and we're just the
hard drive is out there and we're just the working memory, right? And so, this is something that was downplayed, a few decades ago, and not that it's accepted now. It's certainly controversial, but a few decades ago, there was just, okay, well, all of these near-death experiences can be written off as people who are charlatans and stuff. But since then, there's been exponential numbers of cases that have popped up, and we've been able to systematically study them. And we're finding out that, well, there is something to them, and there are patterns that appear across instances. And so we can look at this phenomenon with some scientific rigor, And the article that you sent me was, one of the few cases that was able to be looked at using neurological machinery, right? MRI and this sort of thing to track what has happened. And there was something that was seen as definitively strange, right? And whether you took a physical reductionist view or whether you took a mystical view, what struck me with that is how sort of diametrically opposed the outcomes became, right? If you took a physical reductionist view, it was really one of the saddest things that you could imagine, these last few minutes of the dying brain.
Yep.
And if you took a mystical view, well, then it was very uplifting and enlightening, right? That maybe death was just a transition period between something else. And we don't know the answer. And I think that as a responsible scientist, right, you have to go with the physical reductionist argument. You don't have to, but it's safe to say that, well, we can't know what's beyond it, so we have to work within the framework of what we do know.
Well, we've used that term before. The physical reductionists are saying this is what seems to be happening now. Oh my, here's the mysterious thing. We're trying to figure this out now, and that's good. There are those who argue that evolutionarily, this is where it connects, I think, with what we associate sometimes with shadows. Evolutionarily, that it has been argued that we would develop a sense of things after our own death because that makes our deaths easier.
Right.
Okay. So I'm casting a shadow. I don't know where that shadow's going, but maybe I can follow it. That it's leading somewhere else. Who is Michelangelo? No, Leonardo da Vinci said the beginnings and ends of shadow lie between the light and darkness. So this is an in-between zone. This, which goes back to the folkloric or mythic ideas that, that's not a portal exactly, but it's a conduit
Yeah.
from here to somewhere else. And the artist, Leonardo da Vinci, the shadow is the means by which bodies display their form. The forms of bodies could not be understood in detail, but for shadow.
Yeah.
The whole artistic view of things like sfumato and chiaroscuro and the idea that I have learned as an artist that you define things by absence, by the space behind them.
Yeah, and Da Vinci, as a master of shadow, right? Really, just some of the paintings you go, what makes this painting so realistic? It's the shadow, but the shadow is not real. It is not there. On a painting, the shadow is an artistic creation rather than anything that is actually happening. And
so there's another example in our stack of
yeah, and so I think that this is sort of leading us into the psychological, right? Which, in psychology, the shadow stems back to psychoanalysis, right? Freud and Jung looking at how conceptions of the id and the superego relate, and this conflict, right? When they and the shadow that emerges from. You want to cover that a little bit?
Yeah, I do, because I sometimes get a little growly with how people have downplayed Jung. I know that Jung is no longer the sexy thoughts that people used to think. People have downplayed Freud, and I understand why, but Jung was Freud's student, just as Aristotle was Plato's student. And when you have people of that kind of extraordinary thought processing going on, and they take the thoughts of their mentor and they just go someplace often new, I think it's worthy keeping in mind what was accomplished. So the shadow is the thing that we need. We cannot be without it and be healthy. I think that Jung was accessing Buddha again, to come back and say, okay, so if you're right in your mind, if your mental health is, he didn't use that term, but the mental health is balanced, then you're balanced between it's not your dark and your light side. You're balanced between the yin and the yang of your being. And if your shadow is not acknowledged, and you don't wrestle with and examine and understand what is pushing you to shadow things, the negative, whatever we associate with that, then you're not going to be balanced. And because you're ignoring it, it's going to overtake you.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Because I think that it shares some relationships with what Lincoln said, but whereas Lincoln refers to reputation, so it's how other people are perceiving you, right? What you are and how people perceive you. With Jung, it's really more an intrinsic view, right? What you are and how you perceive you. And so that's kind of what encapsulates this idea of the shadow, right? Is unperceived, things about you that fall into a blind spot, something that you are unaware of or cannot bring yourself to confront. Right?
I went back to some of his writings, and one of the things that this is a brief quotation, but I think I lifted this because I wanted it to fit with what we were going to talk about, and I didn't know quite where we were going to be going, but it does. What you just said: a man who is possessed by his shadow is always standing in his own light and falling into his own traps and living below his own level. So if we think of shadow beneath us, that speaks. If you're so obsessed with your shadow because you're not trying to make these parts of yourself integrated, and I know that's for some practicing psychologists and psychiatrists and mental health professionals, I'm talking as if I'm a shamanic or something. I don't think of Jung as shamanic. I know this is old stuff, but I think there's still something to it.
Yeah.
For me. So So if you're possessed by your own shadow, it's as if you are your shadow because you haven't been able to reach the light. You're not understanding the relationship between the light and yourself and the shadow. So,
Yeah, it's really I mean it's kind of Plato's cave in a simplified way, right? You're seeing the
yes,
shadow and you're
yes.
confusing that with being you when you don't realize that you are the one casting the shadow in some ways. But yeah, and I think I stumbled across shadow mathematics, right? Which I
Okay.
won't even attempt to describe, but there was an interesting facet of it that I thought was relevant, right? Where the use of it is to explore infinities, infinitesimally small and infinitesimally large mathematical concepts.
So shadow math is kind of quantum.
Yeah, and I think that what's interesting is how that relates when we're talking about the volume of shadows, right? If we're standing at the equator and it's noon, there is no shadow, right? It's almost infinitesimally small. But if we have that planet that's 100 light years away, all of the volume in it is almost infinitely large, right?
Mm-hmm.
It gives us the ability to explore those types of concepts in a way that relates to the way that we perceive them in real life.
I think that you're hitting on something that is wholly applicable to this event that we will experience, each of us in our own ways, and we will experience dependent upon nature. My wife has this wonderful go-to lately when she talks about the eclipse, because she's a librarian. She's been talking a lot about it, is that you can't capitalize on nature. You can't make nature do what you're advertising.
Right.
And so what you just said, the volume, the sheer volume of the sun and the moon and the earth, and how that can affect us emotionally or just visually.
Hmm.
Even if it's raining or partly raining, under the cloud bank, there's going to be an effect. It's still going to get dark. The air is going to change. The temperature is going to change.
Yeah, and it's this fascinating phenomenon. And well, part of what makes it so fascinating is just the novelty of it, right? We haven't experienced anything like it in our lifetime, and we won't again. But on a daily basis, we experience the drastic and immense impact of Earth's shadow at night. That's what night is, right? It's just Earth's shadow being cast on us from the sun. And everything that changes, right? Everything that goes along with it. And it makes you think about all of the things that are associated with the shadow and associated with the shade. Are they also associated with night? Or does night have its own unique aspects that are different, right? Because I think that we perceive of night as being its own environment, right? Whereas a shadow is something that lives within our sort of experience during the day.
Sorensen talks about some of this when he said, yeah, but he's, at least up to where I've got in the book, he's we do see at night, and you don't even have to have the moon out to see at night, and the stars may be covered by clouds, and you may not have a night light in your house or a street lamp down the street. We're so desperately, if night is just this thing we want to hold off. Light pollution didn't used to be a thing, but we all know it now, right? But even under all those conditions, we can still see. And then he goes, he's where I've gotten to so far. Then he starts to go into, can we see darkness? Technically, not. Not.
Yeah. It's this negative space, right? But like we were talking about, like Da Vinci was talking about, right? With shadows and paintings. They're not real shadows, but there's something that provides that counterpoint and makes things real, gives things depth, right? And that's sort of the importance of it. But yeah, this has been a real fun conversation.
It has.
Until next time, keep pondering.